Okay, so if you look at the education system and how it's designed, it is still very much modeled off of what it has always been modeled off of is, our original form of teaching and learning in the classroom from 100 years ago, right? Like when we started to see public education, commensurate education across the board, standardization, right? Like we still have these same kind of models in play. And when I go into the classroom today, I'm looking at a classroom that reminds me of the classroom that I was in 20, 30 years ago, right? And that is very problematic. But when you look at why we teach what we teach and what is embedded within these subject areas, or what subject areas are more important than others, that's very much rooted in our cultural understanding of what we value, which is aligned with capitalism and the economy and things like that, opposed to beliefs, values of the people to produce a good, well-rounded citizen. And when you look at other countries, sometimes, empathy is a very important thing that they're really teaching at a young age as a foundation. That is not what we do here within our public education system models. And when you look at how this system was designed and the same system being implemented in public schools on reservations, you have a model for a different nation being taught to these people as if this is what it is, this is best for you in order to succeed. And we as educators, we often look to the nearest border and say, we're preparing you for the real world, but at the same time, we're totally not acknowledging their realities or an education system that models what they need. Now, if you look at a lot of the cultural negative impacts that we see today on our reservations are products of what has happened within educational spaces. And if we, to any degree, wanted to acknowledge those realities and try in some way, shape, or form to do anything about it, we'd be looking at ways in which we could design a system that would give it back. If you look at how we're teaching language within tribal schools, chances are it's very similar to teaching Spanish at a public school off the res anywhere in the United States, right? Like it's cute. It's like, hey, we have this stuff and it's culture. Kids are learning, and if they like it and have resources, then they can continue to learn it, right? But it's not structured in any system that actually produces an end result of us wanting anybody else to speak another language than English, right? But if we were a principal or a teacher within a school setting and we wanted to align what we're doing to nation rebuilding, that would be a start to create where the hierarchy of education in English doesn't surpass that of Indigenous language, and to ensure that all students that graduate also speak their native language. Then we'd create a system and we would redesign our school system to model that. If it was around nation rebuilding or in any way, shape, or form giving back what was taken within these academic education spaces. So that is like a foundation of thought in regards to creating a system that ends up changing the realities of communities, and that is one that is very important. When we look at the issues on reservations, as educators, we obviously a lot of times don't realize it, right? Like we put the blame on the people because we refuse to put it in context of history. But if you were to take any town in America, put it in a jar, segregate it from everywhere else, detach it from other local communities, you're gonna see destroyed economy, you're going to see drastic cultural impact. And that was a way of kind of processing like what happened to Indigenous nations. They were put onto reservations, detached from other nations and other communities, totally destabilizing the networks and economies and all this ancient history that had produced very strong, well-to-do Indigenous nations like Lakota Dakota culture, the Ocheti Shikoe, which was one of the most successful Indigenous nations of all North America, right? So when we look at the context of what happened and today trying to address the issues within our communities, we'd be looking at what is impacting our nations. If you look at health-related concerns and where the reservations are, and food deserts and all these different things, then you'd be designing curriculum that somehow address those concerns to make sure that there was healthy options and industries developed to address that need, because it is impacting on a great level the people. You would redesign curriculum and content and everything else to address those major concerns and problems. Indigenous law, you'd be looking at policies in terms of development on tribal lands and grants and systems that made that more possible, or a community in which, as youngsters, aware of all those barriers that makes it very challenging to develop and build on tribal lands, right? Like you'd have education that modeled the impacts that's happening to some way address them, because you want a thriving nation. You wouldn't be modeling it off of a system that was used for a different nation. But that is what we're constantly seeing within like public education, even BIE, even grant schools. I haven't ever been on the res and seen a school that looked very much different than being in Bismarck or another community and seeing like the same kind of curriculum, the same kind of structures. We might have like an Indigenous Day here, something here, but to align a system that is designed for a nation is a completely different process. And this is kind of something that I use in terms of like thinking about this. So you can look at different nations. Chances are they probably have like some nation rebuilding model of things that they want to do and see for their community, right? Like you see that, you address how that aligns with your different standards, your different subject areas, and how you can embed that into your curriculum so that way your students are becoming educated members of a nation, dual citizenship. They know how their system works on the res. They know how to be active in their democracy, in things that will directly impact them. But a lot of times we don't even have like tribal law, tribal government, things like that for subjects on the reservations that are teaching like all these different factors that Indigenous people who are members of a nation should know. They're learning it at home and learning it, you know, from someone else in the community, which is good, right? But like all education systems have something like that structured, their own history, Native American history, but instead it's American history, you know, civics, all these other things that teach you about politics within our school settings that are absent in context with what they need to know for their nation, right? So like those are very simple and basic that most of us can say like, yeah, I can see how that makes sense, right? Like, because every other education system has that for their nation within their school settings, but still we don't see that on the reservation. And this is a thought process that I do to get us thinking about redesigning a system that actually addresses the needs of a people that still meets our standards. You take Dr. Banks' 5 dimensions of multicultural education and you juxtapose that with the concept of nation building. You're putting those two things together to create a system that you redesign your school system that integrates culture effectively. We're not just like sprinkling a holiday here or some kind of activity this day, but it's embedded in your curriculum, and that culture addresses your standards, not just what we teach, but also how we teach it. The way in which we should teach should also be modeled off of an Indigenous way of teaching and learning. So even if I'm integrating culture and I'm taking this Joseph Marshall book about Lakota values or what Lakota people feel about the buffalo, and I'm telling them what it is, like what they should think about the buffalo and things like that, I'm still like the knowledge keeper. That's not restorative. That's not empowering. I'm still possessing that culture, their culture, opposed to creating that curriculum where they're funneling through all this information from their elders, from their community members, from their academics. And then when they have the constructed, well understanding of what it means to Lakota people, then they tell you what that means, you know, like, so you can even integrate culture, but do it incorrectly depending on how you teach it. So pedagogy is extremely important about how you're actually teaching it, right? Like if I'm teaching Lakota art, you know, I'm not the knowledge keeper of it. I tell them like, this is the person in which I learned it from. This is how they taught me, you know, and then we open it up where all the knowledge within the room can be shared because there's different ways to do things and people learn different things and students know a lot too. So it's not this like, I know everything and I'm the boss, you know, you try to create community. And those are two like really quick crash courses and like different ways of framing, teaching it and learning and modeling them off of a different approach that isn't so controlling, which is an issue that us teachers and us education systems we have, right? But like knowledge construct is important, pedagogy is important when you're looking at all these different factors, and then also looking at systemic barriers that are impacting access to education and redesigning them, whether it be your behavioral disciplinary models, whether or not that models the nation that you're teaching, or ISS, OSS, and incarceration model that would have been modeled for a different nation, obviously, and look at like, how am I addressing the needs and whether or not I'm doing that culturally responsive. So you have to look at school policy as well, and school structure, and then empowering school cultures, social structures, restorative educational practices, be an ally and a supporter of sovereignty, right? And you can do that within your context of teaching and learning. Like, I'm an art teacher, and if you look at that in the context of art, you can say, oh, decorations, design principles, things like that, opposed to like, what is art? Art is artifacts. Art are things that are functional within Indigenous communities, that allows Indigenous people to retain sovereignty, because the passing down of cultural knowledge through beadwork, through things that they need in order to continue activities as a society that reflects culture, is important to the retention of culture. So if our principals and administration knew that, they wouldn't just be looking at like, oh yeah, art's fun, or like, oh, we might cut that program because, we're lacking funding now, and maybe instead we'll have a trailer come and do one thing so they meet their humanities requirement. Like, those would be things that would be viewed in a different light, because they understand how important they are for what a nation has to do in order to retain sovereignty, right? Like, you would be looking at it differently, not through a Western lens, but through a lens in which produces and retains a certain outcome. And that's a whole different frame of reference, whether it be the art room, like the example that I'm using, or other things in terms of language and language integration into your subject areas, into all subject areas, into your school system that produces speakers by the time they leave your school. So with saying this looks at the concept of nation rebuilding and how it really much starts with education. It always has, right? Even in other cultures and communities, you are educated based off of what your nation needs and what's most productive and desired for your society. Stories, the skills that you need, the roles that you play within your community to strengthen your nation. And we're not seeing that alignment with how we're structuring schools on the reservation, because they model very much anything else, but you can still do that while following, Common Core or the standards in which you have to teach, but you have to switch your frame of reference.